How's it, guys? Welcome to Thursday. As we said, we're going to be doing some S6L overviews today. I've got a little setup going here. I've got some background music going to keep the mood going. You'll see I've got 4 sources. I've got 2 cameras and the 2 screens of the console. You should be able to see that now. So I've got the screens are a little bit dark. I apologize for that, but when they go full screen, they don't look too bad. So just to emphasize what we're doing today, I'm going to look specifically at snapshots. And I'm not going to go too in depth, but I'm going to explain the basic concept behind snapshots and their workflows and what are the technical elements within snapshots. So if you go to a large screen on this one, you'll see I'll go to my snapshots window, which is clean. I've got nothing there. I'm going to pull the music down. Actually, I'm going to leave the music running for now. And then in snapshots, and the reason it's called a snapshot is it takes a picture of the desk in its entirety. In other words, all the elements within the console in your current setup, it's like taking a picture. We're taking a snapshot. So all parameters, all channels, everything that's included and currently active on the console from a hardware perspective. The only thing that is excluded is your virtual stuff, in other words, your plugins, by default. There are ways to include them, and we'll get to that. But by default, if I go to my snapshot window now and I press New Snapshot, you'll notice that the faders at the bottom go red. There's a red line called Untitled. I can double tap on that screen quickly and just label it for our test. And now we've got a snapshot called Test. Everything is just red, and you'll notice towards the right-hand side there's what we call a scope set. Scope set is the elements of the snapshot which you are choosing to prioritize to allocate to the recall scenario. So when I press recall now, it's going to do fader motions only. So if I pull the music down, for example, and I didn't touch my speaking voice, if I now hit recall on that test, the music's back. I can even get fancy. I can go to the right-hand side. I'm going to put a fade time in there. I'm going to pull the music down again. The next song is going to start. And I'm going to hit recall again. And it just faded the music in nicely. So even if I push the music up a bit louder, fades it back down. So I put a time lapse of a crossfade of 1 second on there. So it's a nice way of controlling, in this case, my fader or my mute. If I mute the music, and I press recall, music's unmuted. Now I can't unfade a mute. Mute is a fixed parameter, so it's on or off. So within your crossfade section, just a quick one, any parameter that is a variational change, so a fader, an EQ, frequency select, anything like that has got variation to it, will be involved in your crossfade. But switches, mute switches, on-off switches, all of those will just be instantaneously. I can make a new snapshot, so I can pull the fader down and make the music a bit softer. And all I do now is I say another new snapshot. So now we've got another line. See the green line, which the green indicates is the currently active snapshot. It's gone to a slanted text because I've edited it. The new one, I'm going to label this low music. Okay, so if I now go back to my first one, see it's orange because it's the one I've currently selected. If I hit recall, music fades up a little bit. If I go to the next one, recall that one, music goes down again. So the only difference between those two when I created them was the level of the music playing underneath what I'm saying. The second one, I don't have a crossfade, so I'm going to just add a crossfade in there quickly. So if I go to the previous one, now on the console here on the left-hand side, you'll see a little MLM, the main live module. So this has got a nice little feature set right in the middle here called previous and next. So if you are running snapshots, I can go to previous snapshot or a next one. In this case, previous is lit because I don't have a next one. So if I go to previous one, it goes to the previous snapshot. You can hear the music level. Now while I'm talking, I want to go to lower music. I press next, and the music goes down a bit. I can make that a little bit more aggressive. If I go to my previous one, which is the first one, I can go to even start from a presentation point of view. So I'm going to allow music. Then I press next, and the music fades down. Now that previous one was a fader movement. That wasn't an actual saved snapshot. If I wanted to start the show like that, I could put the music up and then store that snapshot in that mode. And there we go to low music on the next one. So my previous one has loud music, and that one's got soft music. So that, and on the right hand side of the little display here, you can see my two snapshots, which are test and low. Just a quick one, you'll notice there's 3 color variations here. There's the orange, which is currently there, which is like an orangey lemon yellow, which is basically telling me that that snapshot is currently active and targeted. Targeted meaning if I press store or recall or whatever I do on the side, whether I'm doing updates or edits or anything like that, or duplicating, that's the one that's being duplicated because it's the targeted one. If I go to the previous one with my finger and I just press test, I might use the mouse so you can see the movement on screen. I'm going to use the mouse. I don't like using the mouse because it slows you down. Now you'll see there's 2 colors. There's a red and a green. Green indicates the currently active scene, snapshot. Red indicates the currently targeted snapshot. So I can store to a snapshot that I'm not currently busy with. So in this case, if I wanted to change this music level, if I change it now, or even switch it off, pull it down completely, and on the test one, which is the targeted one, I press store and I confirm the store. If I now recall that one, I'll do it on the screen again with the mouse, you'll notice there's no music. Now when I go to the low music, which is the next one, it comes back to the low volume. So I was on the low music snapshot when I saved the value of the music to the previous one, which is labeled test. So those are just the 3 colors I wanted to point out. Now let's move across to the scoping section. So that's what the red at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that there's all the faders are currently red. And on the right hand side of the menu, there's a fader and mute that are red. That means those are the elements that are currently scoped. So if I recall any snapshot or save previous or next, those are the only elements that are going to change. Now underneath that, you'll see there's EQ, dynamic pan, bus, in, out, hardware, VCA, pre, name, matrix, layout, auxiliary mon, auxiliary effects, auxiliary user, delay, MIDI, and plugins. Those are all the scopable parameters, and then underneath is all the channels. Now you'll notice, I'm going to use a mouse again, if I go to a bunch of channels, for example in this case I'm going to go to the music that's playing. You can see the music playing there. I'm going to unscope it, which I click on it, it's no longer red. I'm also going to go, I'm on the low music one, so I've unscoped the one that says test. So when I now recall that one, you'll notice the music's not changed because I've unscoped it. In other words, I'm telling the desk in that picture, don't look at that channel, ignore that channel. The difference is still there. If I go and rescope it, I haven't pressed save or anything like that. If I go rescope it and I press recall again, the music's down. So if I go to the next one, which is low music, and I unscope and I recall it, my music's not there. If I scope it again and recall it again, fades in my music again softly. My music might be a little bit soft, so if you're not listening loud enough, you might be missing it. So I'm going to make it a little bit more obvious. So I'm going to put the music there, and now because that snapshot is yellow, which means it's targeted and active, I'm going to store. And I think in the demonstration I just did, you'll notice that the scoping has got nothing to do with storing. Scoping is purely, if I go to the previous one, which is test, and I recall that one, no music, and I change the scope set, or even I can leave the channel scoped and unscope fader. So in that one, if I go to my low music one and I recall, and I go back to my test one and I recall, nothing changes because I've unscoped the fader movement. Because there might be other elements on that channel that I want to happen. Because if I unscope an actual channel, anything about that channel is being ignored. But if I've got a scope set going, in this case where I've got on the right hand side certain parameters scoped, Now if I go back to fader and I hit recall again, it'll fade out, and so forth. So when I start adding other elements, I want the channel scoped so that I can do specific things. So I can unscope fader and mute and just scope EQ, for example. So if I go to I'm going to go back to those ones. I'm going to go to my low music one, recall that one. I'm going to duplicate it. So it's saying low music 2. So this one I'm going to call EQ change. Now in EQ change, on the music channel that I'm currently playing, I want music in EQ to change. So I will target that snapshot, make it red. I will untarget or unscope fader and mute, scope EQ. On the right hand side of my fader bank, I can say don't scope any channels except that one channel. So now on that one channel, which is music, I'm looking at the EQ. So if I select my music that's playing and I go to my EQ section, I'll do it on this screen so you can see. I'll do it on this one. If I go do an EQ on, and I'm just going to do a wacky one so you can hear it. So you can hear that EQ. So on that filing, snapshot, I'll go to that EQ change and I'm going to store that scenario. Okay, I'm going to recall that one. So now that's what that EQ sounds like. If I pull the fader down and I go to the previous snapshot, which should just bring in my music, you'll notice it still sounds weird because the EQ is still there. Now, when I created the snapshot that said low music, there was no EQ on the playback music. Now, I don't have to go and fix that now. The only difference is it's not scoped. So if I include the scope of EQ on the previously existing snapshot and I press recall now, my music's fixed. I didn't have to resave the snapshot. When I took the snapshot, the EQ was flat. I just purely wasn't looking at it with the scope set. So that's something that you've got to get your head around and how the scoping works. When I take a snapshot, regardless of scope set, it's looking at all parameters. Scoping is only what am I actually looking at. So if I go to the next one, funky EQ again, previous one, flat EQ again. So if I go to this one and I unscope, next one, and I come back, EQ stays there. So it's just a matter of thinking about, so if this was, for example, dynamics on drums, for example, you could have two snapshots, one for normal play and one for brushes. When the guy's playing with brushes, your gate settings are all over the place. So you can create a snapshot, only scope your drum channels, your toms, and only scope dynamics. And in dynamics, what you're going to do is you're going to have your snapshot the way it is now, or you're going to duplicate it from an existing song so that all the other settings are there, and all you're going to do is switch on and off your dynamics. So when I switch, I can have one that's labeled tom dynamic on, tom dynamic off, or tom gates on, tom gates off. And when I recall those, I'm switching gates on and off. And you can make those momentary. If I make it a momentary one, you'll notice on the left-hand side of my snapshot, there's a 1, 2, and 3, which is sequential. So when I'm going pre or next, it's switching between those. But if I make this EQ change one, for example, a momentary one, you'll notice it no longer has a number. So now my next and my preview only relates to the sequential numbered snapshots. So I can't by accident, by hitting next or previous, change the EQ on my music. But I can select it manually and hit recall. Okay, so if you've got a lead vocalist that's going and you want that megaphone effect on his vocal, you can have an EQ or a snapshot which is on his channel, on his EQ, do this. You can even have a crossfade, so it happens slowly or it can happen fast, but it doesn't have to be one of my next or previous. In other words, I can scroll through my songs, and at any point where I want that effect, I can just recall that snapshot. Now, I don't have to be in my snapshot window. I can do that with function keys. If I run function keys, I can assign a function key to that momentary snapshot, which means at any point I can hit it and there it goes. But now you must remember there has to be an undo of that. In other words, if I then change that EQ, I've got to go back to the normal EQ. So what I would do is I would make two momentary ones, one with EQ effect on, one with EQ effect off. And the on and off is pretty much going from what it is to an effect and back to what it was. So it does take some planning, it does take some setup. If you know a band well, you can create quite a few of these things that can be for your guitarist. You know, if you're running a guitarist, you know there's got you've got two electric guitars, slightly panned left, slightly panned right, but there's a solo in one song. You can make a snapshot where the pan control of a certain guitarist just brings him to the middle so his solo can get bigger, and that can be a momentary as well. It can be sequential, because one of the things we'll talk about, and I spoke to James the other night after our chat. He's going to come on and we're going to talk about Ableton a little bit, and obviously with Ableton you can be running LTC. When you're running LTC, I'm going to right click here within my snapshots. I'm going to show, sorry, I don't have LTC on at the moment. There's a time code, but it's grayed out, so I can't select it. But when there is time code, I'm going to switch it on. I'm going to do a manual one. So I'm going to go my snapshots on my setup page. I'm going to go generate LTC, format LTC. I'm going to just do MTC for now so I can generate it myself. And press play. I go back to my snapshots. I can now say show MIDI time code. So if I right click on this, you can see that it's put a timecode element in there, which is MTC at this point in time. And at the bottom of my screen, I don't know if you can see it, it's quite small, it's running MTC generator. So if I'm listening to a band and it's going and I hear an effect that I want to have triggered at a specific time, I can just right click, it grabs that actual time slot, and I can set the time slot. If I know the time slot, say it's 58 seconds into the song, I can just manually edit it. So there's different ways of using that as well. So if you're running time codes, I can also then say go chase time code, and then I switch on the time code icon next to that snapshot. So it doesn't have to be for every snapshot. So if you start a song on the time code, at a certain point in the song, the toms gates need to go off. And instead of you being ready with a function key, or you might be distracted with a lead vocal, it can happen automatically just following your LTC, giving that the band is actually playing to that. On most times, if you are running LTC with click, you can be pretty sure that the band's actually doing that. If something happens with your LTC and it goes haywire, you can just unchase it. You can switch it off there at the top, and you can go back to manual. So it becomes a very interactive tool. On some other consoles, we have what we call scenes, where you save a scene and you recall a scene. So it's replacing the entire scene set. Almost all the high-end console has snapshot elements and scoping elements. Soundcraft has it, Digico has it, and they all work in different ways. This format of snapshots and scoping has been there from the start of the Avid range of consoles, from the D-Show, the Profile, the SE48, and this window has hardly changed. The colors changed. They've actually added one or two extra ones. For example, they added the layer button, they added the effects monitor and the effects auxiliaries and the user line, but the rest is all the same. They've added LTC. It used to just be MTC. They've added LTC now. And because it's integrated with Pro Tools, I've got my markers in Pro Tools. So if I'm running a Pro Tools session that's recording my gig, as I'm going next through my snapshots, it's dropping markers in Pro Tools, which means later when I come back to a virtual sound check, when I recall a snapshot, Pro Tools will go to that specific song that I've just hit record on. And then I can run my virtual sound check like that. So it's a very intuitive way of working. Obviously, from a snapshot perspective, we can go a lot deeper. There's some user scope sets we can look at, where you can do different elements on scoping. There's also a typical recall safe. Recall safe is something similar to what you get on Yamaha and many other consoles, where I can just take a parameter. So even if a channel is, so if I take my mic, for example, or anything like that, or the background music, I'm going to go to the background music and say fader. Now I've recall safed the fader. So now if I go to my main one, even though I've got it scoped, if I recall, the EQ is changing, but the fader's not moved. Notice that. So because I've recalled saved the actual fader on that channel. So you can get very specific with what you want happening on your console, because the reason for that is you're going to go, well, if Snapshot's that powerful, why do I need recall save? Well, if you think about it, I might be scoping channels. I might have a Snapshot that's doing multiple things. So I've got quite a few channels scoped. On some of them, I want the fader to move, and on others, I want only EQ and dynamics to happen. So I can go to the user auxiliary scope or the recall save and select specific elements of channels to be saved and available to you, so that you can have a combination of effects happening while you're mixing. Now, this is not automation. A lot of guys go, well, can your DAW automate? You can create automation like symptoms. In other words, you can have hundreds, you can have 999 snapshots, of which 45 can be for one song, which means intro, vocal up, first keyboards, and you create snapshots for every one of those, one time code with specific things happening, and you've got the desk responding, and it can look like automation, but it's not automation. It's elements that you've programmed. I did that when we do voice. I created in some of our group songs, because they were singing literally 2 or 3 words at a time, but they were all over the stage, and there was 18 mics. Now, for me to push 18 mics up is very noisy on a broadcast. But also for me to follow that quickly from who's singing what, because they weren't singing sequentially. If they were going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I could have done something there. But they were going 1 and 2 were singing, then number 17 was singing, then 14 singing, then all that. And if I had enough time to memorize that, I could get there, but it would get quite complicated. So what I did was I recorded it, I virtual sound checked it, I duplicated the opening one, I just selected the faders of all the vocal mics on my scoping, and I assigned every single one of them to a time code slot to fade up and down. And I would fade up slightly early and I would fade down a little bit late. In other words, like a half a second or a second, depending on how fast the song was. So that if someone was, early on a mic or a little bit late on a mic, I could catch it. What obviously, again, we're assuming people are doing what's playing, but because there's time code playing and there's track and there's time and click running, the timing element will be there. And then if you sit back and look at that song, the desk within that song, you'll see a lot of fader movement and automation happening based on all the snapshots that have been programmed. Obviously, the screen over here, I've been using it so I can demonstrate, and I'm using the mouse so you can see where I'm moving. But on the MLM here in the middle, there's a little snapshot section where I've got a store button, a recall button, and a preview button. Just quickly, preview is a very good way of, if I hit preview, you'll see across the screen now it's displaying preview. Then I can target my EQ change. I can recall my EQ change. If I now look at that channel, channel's not scoped, haha. So EQ change that one, recall that one, input that one, sorry. There we go. So that's the EQ that would happen, but you're not hearing it because I'm in preview mode. So I can go into preview mode and look at what's going to happen if and when I hit recall. So if I move faders, for example, and I stay in my snapshot window, you'll even see I'm moving the fader now, you're not hearing it. So it's disengaged the control surface, and it's visualizing where the plugins, the snapshot's going to go. So if I go out of preview mode, now you'll notice that if I highlight some of these channels, I'm just going to scope them. So these channels in that scene, if I move them, that's their selection. And if I go fader, you'll notice that there's an indication of where the fader is going to move to at the bottom. There's a little green dots. So when I push recall, that's where these faders are going to go to. There we go. Okay, so now if I go back to that one, back to that. So it's a nice indication. So when you're targeting a snapshot, you get a visual indication on the screen of a couple of the elements. But obviously, if you want to see EQ or anything like that, you can hit the preview mode. You can even make a change. If you go into preview, and I'll do that now quickly, there's music playing. So I'm going to unscope this one. So in this one, I previously had just the EQ happening, but I can now have a fader movement happen. So I'm going to go into preview mode On this one, I'm going to make the music louder and it's going to sound like a telephone. Now I can store it. I can go out of preview mode, and now when I recall it, change happens. Okay, so you can make changes. So if you've done a song and you're in the next bit and you're getting an idea that I missed that toms are a little bit soft in that one snapshot in the previous song, I can go to preview mode, go there, make the toms a bit louder, save it again and carry on with my life. And next time I get to that song, the change will be there. So it's a very powerful tool from that perspective as well. The update and the edit we'll look at a different stage. Then obviously we've got new and duplicate. If I duplicate a snapshot, like this one which says EQ change, you'll notice that the EQ and the fader and even the scoping of the channels are duplicated. If I say new one, it only does the same thing. So you'll notice, well, there's no difference between new and duplicate. Okay, what's the difference? The difference is plugins. Now remember I spoke earlier about incorporating plugins into your snapshots. Now at this point, our plugin rack, if I go to my plugin rack, you'll notice that there are plugins in there. I've got my mastering plugin, I've got a couple of things there. I've got some effects and going for the drums. All of this is still a virtual rack. It's not been affected by my snapshots. And it's the only thing that wasn't incorporated in my snapshot when I saved or created my snapshot. What I can now do is go to plugins and I can go add. I'm going to go to the snapshots themselves. Actually, I'm just going to quickly delete these additional ones I made because they're annoying me. Oop, I just duplicated all of them. Delete. The other D stands for delete. Delete those. Okay, so that EQ change one, if I wanted to go to this one and add plugins, I can either double click on the plugin window here, or I can go to the plugin itself and I can say which plugin do I want to add in. So in this case, I'm going to go to, I don't have one that's not as well. I'm going to do an effects one so you can see it. So I've got reverbs going. So on every plugin, there's an S. I'm going to move it on this side so it's not in your. Okay, so we're going to move it over here so it's closer to me. So on the bottom left corner of every plugin, there's an S with a down arrow. If I click on that, it opens up a list, which I can either create a snapshot, which I'm going to do now, or I can add it to an existing one, which is the currently targeted one, which is EQ change. So when I say create a new one, you'll notice that little square goes red. Red, we know now, means scoping. So I'm scoped, that snapshot is scoped currently to this targeted snapshot. If I go back to music and I go back to the plugins, you'll notice the S is gone because this plugin is not scoped to the currently selected plugin. So if I go back here and I go to this one now, because I made it from the plugin, it's actually labeled it plugin rack 1 slot 4 deverb. That's what the plugin is, and I've got it currently saved. And you'll see on the scope set on the right hand side, plugins are scoped. So by default, you can make momentary plugins or snapshots for specific plugins only. So for effects to happen or reverb change to happen, and you can have it time coded. I can obviously go and add in a bunch of other stuff because again, when I created this snapshot, the other elements about the console was also taken into consideration. So for example, in this case, the scoping of these channels. But for now, if I now press store, so if I go back to this plugin, I'm going to enlarge it so you can see it on the screen. The decay time is 375 milliseconds. If I go and I make that 1.6, and I go to my snapshot, and I say store my snapshot, okay, and I recall it, okay. Now because it's a momentary, that other one is still the active snapshot for my previous and next. So if I go back to the plugin, I'm going to change the decay time, and I'm going to hit recall again. I'm going to do it on the buttons on the MLM. You'll notice, and it shoots back to 1.6. I'm going to change it up again. Recall 1.6. So all I've done is I've created a snapshot with a specific decay time on the reverb. So you can have a couple of those set up as momentaries. So again, if you've got, depending if your band is doing ballads or rock songs or R&B, you can have different reverb settings and you can label them as such, put them on function keys, so that when the band's going and they're going to a ballad, you want a different reverb, you can just hit that key on the function key and the reverb will change on the plugins as long as it's scoped. I've had many guys that have realized the hard way that plugins are not by default in your scope set. They go and do at a festival, there's a profile or a D show or an S6L, and they run their layouts and they do their whole sound check, and the guy's going crazy on the plugins. He saves, he stores, he takes his filing, he puts his USB stick in, he walks away with his show. He comes back, he loads it up, and he's like, his reverb's changed, his dynamics changed, everything's changed on the plugins because they were never scoped. And because they weren't there, they weren't scoped when you stored the plugin, the snapshots, they're not going to be there, okay? All the onboard parameters, like I showed you just now, the EQ, dynamics, everything when I create the snapshot is stored whether they're scoped or not. Plugins need to be scoped in order for them to be saved. Very important thing to remember as a side note. So whenever you walk up to one of these consoles and you want to do your own snapshots, even if you're just doing one snapshot, which is your band's name, the Porfadas, done. The first thing you need to look at, go my plugins, none of them scoped. Quick way there is you go to your snapshots, you go to your I'm going to say new, and I'm going to make this a sequential one. So this is going to be my Porfadas, and I notice now, hang on, there's no plugin. So I can go on the right-hand side of my snapshot window, I can go click on plugins. Instead of going to the plugins page, I can just go here, add all plugins, and there you go, all plugins are added. So now when I go back to my plugin page, you'll notice that they're all red. They've all got a red tag on them. The only downfall with this is now this is also scoped the master plugins for my PA, for example, in this case my broadcast mix. So I can unscope that one plugin by just going remove it, and my left right ones, and remove those. It's a quicker process than doing the plugins in one by one, because what happens through the day at a festival, guys will be fine-tuning the PA, the time slots are different, they've done some stuff, and if you come and recall your scene, you can counteract a bunch of stuff on the PA and actually go backwards in, your mix is still there, but you've changed. For example, if they had a plugin on a matrix which was feeding the beer tent, which wasn't there earlier, and now you hit recall and that plugin goes haywire, the beer tent explodes and you're happy because your mix is there. So just make sure that only the scope plugins that you want are actually in your snapshot, and then you can be happy to recall your snapshot, which I've now done. Notice nothing has changed because this was the scene when I did it, and that's snapshots. If there's any specific questions, just ask them. I'll try and answer those, but that's about what I wanted to look at today. Next time what I'll do is I'll get a little bit more into plugins and the function switches that I spoke about, because it does get very intuitive and very interactive. And what it does, so many guys say, well, if you do that, you're not actually mixing anymore. If you're creating your snapshots right, you're creating your function switch right, and in this console creating your control sets right, it frees you up to be very creative, because you can have a bunch of stuff that happens when you do certain actions, which you normally would take 5-10 seconds to do because you have to press 3 buttons or grab 6 things. Where here, I can have one VCA, which is a special effect, for example, on a vocal, trigger a momentary snapshot recall as well as an EQ and something on a bunch of channels. Or when I pull it down and I pull that VCA down, it counteracts it all again. So instead of me pressing buttons to recall, I can move a fader, and when I bring it back, it's gone. And yeah, it really makes it very versatile, makes it very creative, and you can really enjoy what you're doing and keep your focus where it's supposed to be, instead of head down and everybody only sees your bald spot if you have one. Hope you enjoyed that, and yeah, send the questions. Thank you guys. Like and subscribe to Facebook and YouTube.